settled, the aftermath of the fierce battle came into sharp focus. Myeong-il stood amidst the wreckage, his sword shattered, fragments of the once proud weapon scattered around his feet. A deep, vicious gash marred his chest, the crimson stain spreading across his robes. Despite the grievous wound, he remained upright, his body trembling as if defying the inevitable. His eyes, wide with shock, betrayed the sudden realization of his fate. Blood surged from his lips, the metallic taste overwhelming him. His breathing faltered, becoming shallow and labored, but even in these final moments, a singular thought weighed heavily on his mind. His legs buckled slightly, the strength draining from his form, yet his resolve remained etched in his gaze as he fought to stay conscious, bound by a deep, unspoken duty. Myeong-il's posture wavered before the weight of the confrontation, the toll of the battle evident in every trembling muscle, and with it, the knowledge that his struggle, though valiant, had reached its bitter end. Yeon-Myeong stood frozen, her gaze locked on the shocking scene before her, disbelief flooding her senses. Myeong-il, the sword of 9 rings, defeated, a sight she never imagined witnessing. Yet there he was, motionless, his once indomitable presence reduced to ruin. The reality of the situation crashed down on her, but before she could fully process it, the air around the arena grew tense with the arrival of a group of elders and members of the Black Death Alliance. The crowd stirred in confusion and disbelief, struggling to comprehend the chaos that greeted them. Murmurs of shock rippled through the ranks as they recognized the familiar figure at the center of the arena. The Sword of 9 Rings, a name that commanded fear and respect, had been felled, leaving the onlookers aghast. Whispers of his defeat spread quickly, casting doubt and fear among the gathering. Seeing the opportunity to manipulate the unfolding events, Yeon-Myeong seized the moment. Her voice was steady, yet laden with a calculated twist, as she pointed fingers and sowed dissent. She pinned the blame squarely on the young family head of the Tang clan, fueling the crowd's growing uncertainty. Eyes turned to the supposed culprit, murmurs spreading faster now. How could a boy of such youth have taken down one of the 6 Grand Masters? Their doubt, however, quickly mixed with fear as Yeon-Myeong wove her tale further, framing Myeong-il's death as a desperate act to protect Lady Yeonhee. The mention of their sect leader's daughter struck a chord with the crowd. Fear and panic gripped them, uncertainty giving way to urgency. Though many felt something amiss, the weight of their loyalty and the threat to their own lives pushed them to act. If they could not protect Lady Yeonhee or avenge the fallen master, their fates would surely be sealed. The hesitation in the air dissolved as they rallied together, charging towards the young family head with a singular purpose. Though some remained wary, knowing the one who felled Myeong-il would not be an easy opponent, the combined pressure of their duty and fear spurred them into action. United by the desperate need to protect their own, they surged forward, determined to bring down the one who had caused this chaos. As the throngs of enemies rushed toward Yeon-Myeong, their numbers vast and overwhelming, Murio glanced at the advancing crowd, her eyes narrowing as she murmured under her breath. The sheer magnitude of the force bearing down on them was staggering, and yet, amidst the chaos, Yeon-Myeong remained unshaken. His expression was calm, his demeanor unruffled, as he silently sheathed his sword with precise grace. With a steady breath, he reflected on the confrontation that had unfolded, his thoughts tinged with both regret and understanding. Had it not been for the cunning manipulations of subordinates, the events may have turned out differently. But in the end, the outcome had already been determined by the gap in their cultivation, an inevitability in the art of warfare. Yeon-Myeong's gaze lingered on the fallen Myeong-il, the great swordsman who had met his end with his blade still clutched tightly in hand. Approaching the lifeless figure, Yeon-Myeong's respect for his adversary shone through. Though they had been enemies, there was an undeniable admiration in his eyes for the way Myeong-il had met his death, honor bound to his sword, unyielding even in the face of defeat. Yeon-Myeong approached Myeong-il, his fingers closing around the hilt of Myeong-il's sword. The weight of it felt familiar yet foreign. Lifting the weapon, he acknowledged the fallen warrior's prowess, vowing in quiet reverence to ensure Myeong-il's journey to the afterlife would be worthy of such a swordsman. But before Yeon-Myeong could fully rise, the crowd's attention shifted. Someone in the midst of the fray recognized the blade in his hand, Myeong-il's sword, and panic rippled through the charging enemies. Their fear transformed into a renewed determination, and shouts echoed through the arena as they pressed forward with even greater fervor. Despite the overwhelming numbers advancing toward him, Yeon-Myeong stood unmoved, exuding an aura of calm that seemed to defy the sheer size of the enemy force. With deliberate precision, he tossed Myeong-il's sword into the air. In a seemingly effortless gesture, he raised his hand, and the blade shattered mid-air, splintering into countless fragments. The pieces hung for a moment, suspended like scattered stars before beginning their descent. From the crowd, disbelief rippled through the ranks. The sight of the broken sword fragments drew scoffs and sneers, mocking Yeon-Myeong's apparent desperation. To them, the display seemed like a pitiful attempt to turn the tide, a futile effort to combat the 2,000 warriors that charged toward him. They dismissed the shards as nothing more than remnants of a broken weapon, unable to grasp the danger that loomed. But Yeon-Myeong remained composed, his confidence unshaken. The destruction of the sword had not been a show of weakness, but a calculated move. As the enemies surged closer, their ranks tightening around him, he waved his hand with a calm gesture. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. A vortex emerged, swirling with fierce, uncontrollable energy, born from the fragments of the shattered sword. The air crackled with power as the shards of Myeong-il's blade were drawn into the vortex, fueling its intensity. The fragments, sharp and merciless, became deadly weapons as they tore through the enemy lines. In mere moments, the swirling storm of blades cut through the ranks of the Black Death Alliance with terrifying precision, slicing through armor, flesh, and bone alike. The vortex raged with relentless fury, wiping out wave after wave of enemies, their numbers dwindling in the blink of an eye. And at the center of the chaos, Yeon-Myeong stood motionless, his expression serene as the fragments did his work. The battlefield, once filled with jeers and the sound of charging footsteps, now echoed with the silence of the fallen. Amidst the chaos of the battlefield, Yeep Inji stood among the ranks of the Black Death Alliance elders, his face tense with urgency. As he witnessed his men being mercilessly cut down by the storm of sword fragments, panic seeped into his voice. The massacre unfolding before him was unlike anything he had ever seen, and the technique, devastating in its elegance, triggered a sudden realization. It resembled the legendary Tang clan's 10,000 Heavenly Flower Rain, a technique thought lost to time. His disbelief grew as the ancient and fabled art resurfaced before his eyes, leaving him to question how such power had returned. Amidst the carnage, Yeon-Myeong maintained his composure. His attention shifted to Murio, who stood ready by the sideline of the arena. With confidence in her abilities, he trusted her to handle any stragglers who might slip past the vortex of blades. The bond between them, forged through battle, was unspoken but clear. They each had their roles to play, and she was prepared to meet her responsibilities with unwavering resolve. As Yeon-Myeong prepared for the next wave of enemies, Murio braced herself, her determination solidified. Her role as his bodyguard was not a mere formality but a duty she embraced fully. With the battlefield becoming more perilous by the second, her focus sharpened, ready to deal with any threats that made it through Yeon-Myeong's deadly assault. Yeon-Myeong's movements were swift and precise, his body becoming a blur of motion as he unleashed the iron shard volley technique. His speed defied the eye, each strike cutting down an opponent in an instant. With every step, he weaved through the sea of enemies, his attacks as graceful as they were lethal. The air around him buzzed with the sharp sound of metal slicing through flesh, as he eliminated foe after foe, his mastery of the technique undeniable. However, the sheer numbers of the Black Death Alliance proved overwhelming. Even as his wide-reaching skills tore through the ranks, more enemies flooded the battlefield, their numbers seemingly endless. The vortex continued its deadly spin, but the tide of bodies pressed forward relentlessly, determined to close in on him. Despite his efficiency in dealing death, the crowd surged, their sheer volume threatening to break through his defenses. The battlefield was a whirlwind of chaos, with enemies falling one after another beneath Yeon-Myeong's relentless assault. His speed was blinding, his movements too fast for the crowd to track. Desperation settled into the ranks of the Black Death Alliance, their attempts to approach him futile. Shouts of frustration and fear rippled through the mob, voices growing more frantic as they realized they couldn't even get close to their target. Yeon-Myeong was like a phantom, striking swiftly and disappearing before they could react. Among the panicked ranks, one voice rang out, filled with hopelessness as he acknowledged their inability to match Yeon-Myeong's power. The realization spread like wildfire, and soon, a shift in focus occurred. Desperation gave rise to cunning as one member of the alliance spotted an alternative target, the figures of Murio and Yeon-Myeong, standing just outside the fray. Clad in the uniforms of the Tang clan, they became the new focus of the mob's attention. A plan quickly formed among the disheartened crowd. They abandoned their futile attempts to challenge Yeon-Myeong directly, their eyes now fixed on Murio and Yeon-Myeong. The cry to capture them echoed through the ranks, a surge of bodies quickly turning toward the pair. If they couldn't bring down the monstrous force that was Yeon-Myeong, they would instead seize his companions, offering them as trophies to the sect leader in a desperate bid to salvage their dignity. The mass of enemies surged toward Murio and Yeon-Myeong, hoping to overwhelm them, while Yeon-Myeong remained a deadly blur in the distance, continuing his onslaught against the ever-growing wave of enemies. Murio stood in disbelief as Yeon-Myeong made an unexpected offer. His words had struck her deeply, offering a possibility she hadn't dared to imagine: the cure for her dead vein syndrome. She had lived with the condition for so long that the thought of relief seemed almost surreal. The syndrome, marked by 3 cold energies blocking her meridians, had always been a quiet, constant discomfort, but it had never reached the point of threatening her life. Murio's immediate reaction was one of skepticism, her thoughts flashing to her sister who had once suffered similarly. The method used to treat her had been invasive, requiring a vulnerability Murio wasn't willing to endure. With a resolute shake of her head, she rejected the offer. The discomfort, she reasoned, was manageable. She had trained her body to compensate, and in her mind that was enough. Yet Yeon-Myeong wasn't deterred. He understood her hesitation, but his approach was different from what her sister had gone through. There would be no need for the same invasive treatment. His method, though unorthodox, would not require such vulnerability. But that wasn't the only reason for his insistence. Murio had become a formidable force in her own right, unknowingly rivaling the elites of the Bangui Brigade, even while her meridians remained blocked. To Yeon-Myeong, this was proof of her exceptional talent in martial arts, a talent that could be fully unleashed if her condition were cured. He urged her to consider it. If the dead vein syndrome was treated, if her meridians were fully opened, her strength would reach new heights, potentially elevating her to the level of a clan elder. The thought lingered in the air, an opportunity for Murio to unlock her full potential. Yet, despite Yeon-Myeong's reasoned argument, her decision remained weighed down by a lifetime of habit and wariness, uncertain if she was ready to embrace what lay beyond her current limits. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Murio remained calm and collected, moving through her enemies with deadly precision. Each strike was swift, efficient, and lethal. Her movements flowed seamlessly, a calculated dance of martial prowess that left no room for hesitation. One after another, her enemies fell, unable to keep pace with her strength or match her skill. As the realization of their overwhelming disadvantage set in, the remaining fighters from the Black Death Alliance shouted in desperation. They had underestimated her, thinking her an easy target, but now they were beginning to understand the grave mistake they had made. Panic rippled through the crowd as they struggled to deal with the seemingly unstoppable force that was Murio. Amid the chaos, Murio turned her attention to Yeon-Myeong, who stood behind her, wide-eyed and frozen. With a sharp command, she urged the younger one to stay close, knowing that protecting someone in the heat of battle was far more difficult than it appeared. The weight of responsibility pressed on her, but she held her ground, shielding Yeon-Myeong from the advancing enemies with unwavering resolve. Yeon-Myeong, meanwhile, watched in disbelief. Murio's strength was beyond anything she had imagined. The precision and grace with which she dismantled her opponents left her speechless. In that moment, Yeon-Myeong realized how mistaken she had been to assume Murio and Yeon-Myeong were simply a group of talented youths. They were far more than that, stronger even than the heirs of the most powerful sects. As the battle raged on, a deep sense of regret welled up within Yeon-Myeong. She had neglected her training, thinking she had time, thinking that her current state was enough. But watching Murio fight, she felt the weight of her own inadequacy. In the midst of the chaos, all she could do was stand behind Murio, powerless to contribute, helpless in the face of the danger that surrounded them. Yeep Inji, standing among the ranks of the Black Death Alliance, barked out an urgent command. He knew they couldn't match Yeon-Myeong's sheer power head-on, but he also knew no martial artist's internal energy was limitless. If they could endure the wind pressure for long enough, they might just overwhelm him through sheer numbers. His voice rang out with desperation, urging his men forward despite the damage they would suffer. The strategy was clear: surround Yeon-Myeong, suppress him, and break his momentum. In response to his order, the alliance members surged forward, rushing toward Yeon-Myeong with reckless abandon. They stacked themselves around him, pressing in from all sides, hoping to drain his energy by force. As the mass of bodies closed in on him, someone from within the crowd shouted triumphantly. The wind pressure that had been keeping them at bay was weakening. For a moment, it seemed their gamble was paying off. But amid the tightening formation, Yeon-Myeong remained calm, his eyes taking in the chaos around him. He realized the strategy. The enemies were allowing themselves to be torn apart, driven by a fanatical determination to suppress him. The thought crossed his mind, questioning what kind of leader could inspire such loyalty, compelling them to risk their lives so readily. But this was no time to dwell on such matters. With quiet resolve, Yeon-Myeong unsheathed his sword. The time for contemplation had passed. In an instant, his annihilate technique was unleashed. From the center of the surrounding mass, his blade moved with frightening speed and precision. His sword cut through the stacked enemies effortlessly, the sheer force of his strikes dismantling their formation without resistance. Bodies fell as his technique tore through them, scattering the alliance members like leaves in a storm. The stacking formation, which had seemed so solid moments ago, crumbled in the face of his overwhelming power. Yeon-Myeong stood frozen, her mind reeling as she witnessed the terrifying power that Yeon-Myeong wielded. In mere moments, he had annihilated half of the 2,000-man army that surrounded him. She could hardly believe it. This was not luck or coincidence. His mastery, his strength were far beyond anything she had anticipated. The fact that he had overpowered a Fire Realm master with a single strike was no fluke. Numbers, as she now realized, meant nothing before him. Her heart raced as she quickly formulated a new plan. She knew throwing more lives into the fray would only lead to further bloodshed. With a sudden shout, she called for the remaining forces to stop, urging them to back off and save themselves. No matter how many attacks, there was no victory to be found against such an opponent. Turning her attention to Yeon-Hee, whom she held captive, Yeon-Myeong felt a pang of sorrow in her chest. Her voice trembled as she muttered an apology to the young lady, acknowledging the sins she had committed. She knew there would be consequences for her actions, and in time, she would have to face them. But for now, she had no choice but to continue down this dark path. With tears welling in her eyes, she raised her voice toward Yeon-Myeong, her tone both desperate and grim. She declared that no amount of bloodshed could stop him, not hundreds or even thousands of lives. If she truly wanted to kill him, she would need the strength of the sect leader. It was a method she had hoped to avoid, but it seemed she was left with no alternative. Yeon-Myeong, standing amidst the wreckage of fallen enemies, felt a surge of confusion at her words. What could she possibly mean? What was this method she spoke of? His mind raced, but there was little time to dwell on the thought. Suddenly, Yeon-Myeong unleashed her inferno lotus technique, a deadly flame igniting around her as she held Yeon-Hee tightly, her hostage now at the center of her grim plan. The fire crackled, growing more intense with each passing moment, and Yeon-Myeong's expression darkened with grim resolve. She declared that once Lady Yeon-Hee perished, no one would survive to tell the tale. The flames would consume them all, herself included. She was ready to die, and she made it clear that her only solace would be meeting Yeon-Myeong in the afterlife. The heat of the flames burned fiercely, the deadly firestorm swirling around her, leaving Yeon-Myeong with no choice but to confront this deadly situation before more lives were lost.